Once again, I want to welcome our friend Lauren Lewis back, and again, it's wonderful to see you. And all of us are praying that you should continue to have a real refuah shlema. And I don't know if we want you to ride your motorcycle again, but have whatever equivalent activity would be safe and helping. So today we're beginning a big parsha that has many, many laws in it. And we're going to connect the Haftorah to the Parsha as we normally do. Remember what happened last week, of course, was the big event of Matan Torah, and where the Parsha last week ends, Moshe is on Har Sinai, and for 40 days he's receiving the Torah, and all of these laws were given to Moshe while he is in Har Sinai before the sin of the golden calf. Right? So you have to remember, when you read the Torah, these laws are not being communicated to the Jewish people yet, because this is not Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor. Hashem is speaking to Moshe to tell Bnei Israel. Hashem is speaking to Moshe while he is on Mount Sinai for those 40 days. In fact, when you read the Chumash, you always have to differentiate between when is Hashem speaking to Moshe, when is Moshe speaking to Bnei Israel. That does not occur at the same time. In fact, I don't want to talk about this ba'arichas right now, but let me point out the claim that Chazal say that Moshe Rabbeinu received the whole Torah on Har Sinai. Right? Pirkei Avos says, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. That sentence has to be understood, because the way it is commonly understood, it makes no sense. Because Matan Torah is right in the middle, or it's towards the very beginning of after they left Mitzrayim. Now, much of the Torah occurs after the event of Matan Torah. The story of Korach, the story of the spies. Now, if you say Hashem gave that to Moshe b'Sinai, that means Korach is reading from a script. That means Hashem tells Korach, Moshe tells Korach, okay, Korach, according to the script, you're supposed to stand on this line, and the ground is going to open up. So it's obvious that the narrative portions of the Torah were not written down until after they took place. Now, yes, Al Pi Hashem. Hashem told Moshe what to write. That's not the issue. But it was not given at Har Sinai. So, at a minimum, when we say Moshe received the Torah at Sinai, we mean he was given the 613 mitzvahs. In other words, Torah does not mean the 5 books of Moses. Torah refers to the 613 mitzvos that are contained in the 5 books of Moses. But even that is not a full statement, because after all, if you read the Torah, we see throughout the whole Torah, mitzvos are given at different times and at different places throughout the 40 years. So for example, after Nadav and Avihu die, and one reason is because they drank wine, there is a command not to drink wine. Many mitzvahs are given in response to situations. Pesach Sheni, which is almost a year later, there are Tamei people, and Moshe has to ask Hashem. So mitzvahs are given throughout the 40 years. If you were to take a snapshot of the Jewish people in any given year of the desert, until the very end, there were various commandments they didn't have. So what is the claim that Hashem gave the mitzvahs at Sinai? So the Chazon Ish writes, a very, very important basic idea, that you have to differentiate between when did Moshe get the mitzvos and when was Moshe authorized to communicate them to us. Moshe got all of the mitzvos during the 40 days he was in Har Sinai. But he was not yet authorized to tell it to us until various occasions arose. Now, why that's so, you would have to analyze every individual mitzvah for that particular reason. But that is the significance of the ubiquitous sentence, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor, which in English is translated, and God spoke to Moshe saying. So the word saying is superfluous, really. But the Chazon Ish says no. Lemor is very important. Hashem is speaking to Moshe, Lemor, authorizing him to tell this to Bnei Israel. That is the green light. Meaning Moshe got it at Sinai. We get it on various occasions throughout the 40 years. We did not have a whole Sefer Torah till the very day of Moshe Rabbeinu's death. We did not have all of the 613 mitzvos until more or less the very end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. So Moshe Kibel Torah miSinai is when he got it, not when we got it. Now, this explains, the Chazon Ish says, just to digress for a moment, there are 4 situations in the Torah where Moshe Rabbeinu did not know what the halacha was, and he had to consult with the Almighty as to what was the halacha. The 4 cases are, number 1, Pesach Sheni, the people who were tamei, impure, and unable to bring the korban Pesach. Moshe didn't know what to do. He asks God. God says, a month later, they can bring a make-up offering if they are far away, which was not the case in the desert, or they are ritually tamei. Pesach Sheni is number 1. Number 2, Mikoshesh Eitzim, the fellow that was gathering wood on Shabbos. Moshe did not know what the punishment for the offense was. He has to ask God, and God says it is stoning. Number 3 is also a punishment issue. The Mekalel, the person who blasphemed the name of God. Once again, Moshe didn't know what the punishment was. He asks Hashem. Hashem tells him. And number 4 is at the very end of the 40 years, when the daughters of Salafchad, their father had died. Actually, according to some Chachamim, he was the Mekoshesh, he was the gatherer of the wood. When he died, there were no sons. And the question was whether daughters have a right to inherit, because basically it was Salafchad's brothers who were claiming to be heirs if there are no sons. The daughters claim we ought to be heir, and Moshe didn't know. He asks Hashem, and Hashem gives him the halacha that daughters indeed do inherit when there are no sons. Now, in all 4 of these cases, Moshe didn't know the law, and he had to have Hashem tell him. Now, the question is, if you really accept the idea that Moshe was given all the mitzvahs at Har Sinai, then whatever came up later, he was already given that commandment at Har Sinai. What is it that he didn't know? Now, you might learn, and there are some midrashim that say this, that Moshe was, of course, given those laws, but he had forgotten them for various reasons. Hashem caused him to forget, either because at various times Moshe got angry, or Hashem wanted the mitzvah to be rediscovered through the merit of righteous women. Right? That's one interpretation. But the Chazon Ish says a radically different interpretation, which makes a lot of sense. Moshe knew the answer to every single question, but he was not yet given the authorization to reveal it to Bnei Yisrael. So Moshe Rabbeinu's dilemma is exactly this. What if you're sitting, like a business dilemma, what if you're sitting on inside information that could be very, very detrimental or very important to somebody, but you're not supposed to say? And that was Moshe's dilemma. What Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know was not ignorance of the law, but it was not knowing, do I have permission? He asks Hashem. Hashem gives him a green light. This is actually a very, very clear understanding, because if you read the Torah, it's very Parshat that Bnei Yisrael are getting mitzvos at different times because of different events. It didn't all come from Har Sinai. But the Mishpatim were in fact communicated on Har Sinai for Moshe to tell Bnei Yisrael as soon as he comes down. Did you want? Yeah.
Why would God not want him to tell us?
So that is an excellent question, and the assumption has to, you have to, but you can only answer it by giving hundreds of answers. Meaning to say, Bnei Yisrael needed certain mitzvos at certain times. They didn't need all the mitzvos all the time, and there were certain occasions in which their shleimus required that they get mitzvahs at certain times. For example, the Ramban points out a lot of the mitzvahs in the book of Devarim are only relevant when you're coming to Eretz Yisrael, so they were given only there and the like. So there's another interesting medrash that says the following. The medrash points out that Moshe got the bulk of the Torah at Mount Sinai during the day, but the Mishpatim he got at night. These laws, Mishpatim, he got at night. It says, Baboker, he got Torah, Ubalayla, he got the Mishpatim. And the question is, what exactly, because Moshe didn't sleep for those 40 days and 40 nights. The question is, what is the significance of Mishpatim at night? So Rabbi Yishor explains that Mishpatim portrays a very scary world. On one hand, we had Yitzias Mitzrayim, the greatness of God, the mercy of God, the love of God for Bnei Yisrael. You leave Mitzrayim, you have a sense of confidence, a sense of strength, a sense that God is with you and God will protect you against anyone that tries to hurt you. But then I read Mishpatim, and Mishpatim is, on one hand, a lawyer's paradise, but maybe a client's nightmare. Oxen are goring and killing, and slaves, and things are happening, and there are burns, and people lose eyes, and people lose teeth. And a lot of Mishpatim is about accidents and tragedies and destruction, and how do we adjudicate? So in a sense, it seems like a world where everything's falling apart. All of the nightmares are happening. There is death and illness and destruction. Symbolically, Moshe got that at night, because night is always a symbol for concealment, hester panim, when God's presence is not readily perceptible. And the lesson is that even within that darkness, there is the guiding hand of Hashem that tells us how to navigate, how to deal with it, how to reconstruct, how to rebuild. And that's an important lesson. In many, many ways, even from a secular perspective, law is a guidepost through turbulence, through confusion, by creating a structure that even when bad things happen in society, there are ways to try to make it better. And certainly when those laws are divine laws and not just social constructs, this is conducive to try to create a greater amount of shalom in the world. But nevertheless, it's connected tonight because the initial events seem to say that God is letting things go in unpredictable ways. Now, the Haftorah is from the Navi Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu, we've already looked at the three so-called big prophets. They're only called big. I mean, all Nevi'im are big. The idea that there are 12 minor prophets and 3 major prophets is a total misnomer. I mean, every single Navi is great and holy.
Who called them minor? Where did this originate?
I don't know. It's a Christian term. It's certainly not. It's absolutely not a Jewish term. So the word minor prophets makes no sense at all. But the only significance of that designation is simply the size of their books. So we call the major prophets are the ones that are big books, many, many chapters. And they are, of course, Yeshayahu, Yecheskel, and Yirmiyahu. And the so-called minor prophets, which I shouldn't even use the term, but they refer to the Trei Asar, the 12 Nevi'im, whose books are very small, and therefore they were combined in a single work called Trei Asar, which is just Aramaic for 12. But we've spoken before about the fact that, when you learn the big prophetic books, they are very, very difficult books because there's not so much of a storyline. They are poetic, highly poetic, and the language is sometimes obscure. But again, it's important to know that Yeshayahu is much earlier than the other 2 prophets. Yeshayahu was a prophet before the 10 tribes were exiled, meaning to say more than 100 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So he is much, much earlier. Yirmiyahu and Yecheskel, however, are mamash contemporaries. The difference is Yirmiyahu was a prophet in the land of Israel, and he was there at the very time of the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Yecheskel, actually somewhat uniquely, because he's the only prophet who had his prophecy outside of the land of Israel, was exiled to Babylon 11 years before the Chorban. Again, if you recall, Babylon had conquered Eretz Yisrael a number of years before the destruction, and 11 years before the destruction, the aristocracy and the learned classes were exiled to Bavel, and the Dalat Haaretz, the impoverished, ignorant classes, remained in Eretz Yisrael. Yecheskel went with the aristocracy. Yirmiyahu stayed in Eretz Yisrael. So, in a sense, they're both simultaneously prophesying about the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Yecheskel was not an eyewitness to the Chorban. Yirmiyahu was, and of course, the book of Eicha is Yirmiyahu's eyewitness testimony to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Haftarah that we have this for Parshas Mishpatim is Perek Lamed Daled of the book of Yirmiyahu. And the connection, on one hand, to the Parsha is fairly obvious, but the obvious connection, although it is an obvious connection, would seem to be a little bit superficial. And therefore, I want to show that there's perhaps a deeper connection than would be apparent. And that is the following. Mishpatim is a potpourri of many, many, many different laws. Many different laws. In fact, learning Mishpatim with Rashi's Perush is actually a very excellent introduction to Maseches Bava Kama and Bava Metzia. That if you're learning Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, which has many, many different laws about damages, about watchmen of property, etc. All of this is Parshas Mishpatim. So you learn Parshas with Rashi. Rashi brings so much of the Gemara, so much of the Mechilta, etc. It's actually a very, very excellent introduction. I know once people learn Gemara, they stop learning Chumash, unfortunately, but nevertheless, it's a very worthwhile limud. But the very first law in Parshas Mishpatim is about the Eved Ivri, the Jewish slave, not the captive of war, the non-Jewish slave, but an Eved Ivri. How does a Jew become a slave? How does a Jew become a servant? So there's actually two different ways that a Jew can become a servant. One is if he stole and he does not have the resources to make restitution for his theft. So he could be sold into a type of servitude for a limited term of up to 6 years, and through his work he would pay back the theft. That is called a machor beistin, a Jew that is sold into slavery, a form of slavery by operation of the court. Again, let me emphasize, this is only for theft. This is not a debtor's prison or a debtor's servitude. If I borrowed money and I didn't pay, I am not sold into slavery. I just owe the money. Okay, this is not referring to all debts. This is specifically for theft. Now, in addition, a person could voluntarily sell himself into a type of servitude in exchange for room and board if a person has extreme poverty, is unable to take care of himself, and the like. Now, the common denominator is both the machor beistin and the machor atzmo, or the mocher atzmo, the one who sells himself. The Torah says there is a limited term of service. The service can normally not exceed 6 years, and the 7th year, the slave goes free. Now, let me emphasize, this has nothing to do with Shemitah. It is 6 years from the time that he's sold, meaning even if Shemitah is in the middle, Shemitah does not free the Eved. The only thing that does free an Eved, even in the middle of the 6 years, is the occurrence of the Jubilee year. The Yovel year will free him, and the like. Now, then, the Chumash goes on and says, what if after those 6 years, the slave desires the life of being supported by the master? He likes what he's doing. So there is a procedure, a very strange procedure, where his ear is pierced, and then the Chumash literally says he works forever, but Chazal understand forever means until Yovel. So Yovel could be 50 years, or Yovel could be the next day. Once Yovel comes, there is no way he is allowed to remain a slave.
Question?
Yeah.
In the first case where he's making restitution for theft,
Yes.
does the owner make payments to the victim of the theft?
Well, initially it would be from the sales price, meaning the owner. In other words, the basic idea would be that when the Eved is sold on a slave market, so the proceeds of sale are applied to restitution. Now, it is a little complicated because sometimes, let's imagine the theft is greater. Let's say somebody stole $100,000 and spent it, doesn't have the money to pay it back. On the slave market, even for on a 6-year basis, let's say somebody pays only $20,000. So the $20,000 will go to the victim of the theft, but there's still an $80,000 shortfall. So how does the victim of the theft recoup the $80,000 that's still owing? So in truth, my statement earlier that an Eved Ivri cannot work for more than 6 years unless his ear is pierced, that only applies if the theft was paid off. If theft was not paid off, he could actually be resold for successive 6-year terms. Now, that's a little awkward because there's no apparent provision for partial. I mean, let's imagine, he doesn't need 6 years to pay off. Let's imagine that just an extra year would pay it off. So apparently, it's all or nothing, and anything in excess of the proceeds of theft go to the Eved himself. The Eved himself keeps the proceeds, just as one who sold himself might have that. Yeah.
You also mentioned the first thing was that the non-Jewish slave as a captive of war. Was that the only way?
Is it what, say again?
As a captive of war.
No, not the only way. You have to, a captive war is the most common. But indeed, a non-Jewish slave can sell himself, or if a non-Jewish slave has been a slave by virtue of the non-Jews, you can buy a non-Jewish slave from a non-Jewish slave owner. So there are different ways. Now, what is the significance of piercing the ear? I want to mention it now because it will come up, I think, as a very important part of the Haftorah. So Rashi brings from the Gemara in Bava Kama the idea that, in a sense, we are rebuking the slave for wanting to be a slave. Because the ear that heard on Mount Sinai, I am Hashem, your God, you are my slaves. You are not supposed to be slaves to slaves. And you want to be a slave? You know, apparently your ear is not processing what you're supposed to be hearing, so the ear gets hit a little bit. So that's an important idea, that in a sense, the Eved who wants to stick around, that is a spiritual chisara, that is a lack. Now, in truth, the idea that we call an Eved Ivri a slave might be somewhat of a misnomer. It's really what would be called an indentured servant. In fact, Chazal say, he who buys a Jewish person as a slave has really bought a master for himself. Because if there's only one pillow, you got to give it to the Eved. You know, you have to treat the Eved better than you even treat yourself. But okay. Now, the Haftorah has a very, very obvious connection. Yirmiyahu is prophesying a few years before the Churban, and there were Jews who were very poor, and they sold themselves into slavery. And some of the masters refused to relinquish control after 6 years. Or it was even worse, they relinquished control, but then somehow, we're not really clear what the process was, reclaimed them as slaves. And Yirmiyahu says, because of this, God will punish you severely, and you will become enslaved by the Babylonians, etc. So, the simplest, most obvious connection.
Is this going to be a collective punishment of the nation as a result of
Well, it obviously is, because Yirmiyahu connects this to the Churban Beis HaMikdash that will be coming. So, the obvious connection is that the first mitzvah in Mishpatim is about the freedom of giving the slave freedom after 6 years, and Yirmiyahu gives musar, and gives tochacha, gives rebuke about people not following this halacha. But if that would be the only connection involved, that would be a little arbitrary, because the Eved Ivri law is only one law out of many, and you're basically saying, well, the Haftorah has a connection to something in the Parsha, and that's enough, even though it's not connected to most of what the Parsha is talking about. Another aspect to keep in mind is the following. The idea that the prophets are concerned with justice and interpersonal relationships is, of course, a very obvious phenomenon that we know very well. In fact, the Reform movement used to term itself prophetic Judaism. And why did they call themselves prophetic Judaism? Because they said, the prophets didn't care about ritual. The prophets, in fact, criticized ritual. The prophets often say, I don't want your korbanos, I don't want your prayers, I don't want your fast days. If you're not moral to other people, if you don't treat the widow and the orphan and the powerless with kindness and compassion. So the Reform movement, which at least in its earlier stages, now they're a bit more traditional, but in their earlier stages they really wanted to get rid of all ritual parts of Judaism. They emphasized tikkun olam, fixing up the world, social justice. So they like to say, we represent prophetic Judaism rather than priestly Judaism, which was fixated with ritual and the like. So we do know that the prophets talk about social justice all the time. But what's interesting, and therefore you might say, well, for a Navi to condemn slavery and oppression and exploitation, that's consistent with a general theme in the prophets. But the problem is, Yirmiyahu himself is not one of those prophets that talks a lot about social justice. In fact, it's very, very interesting that if you look at the book of Yirmiyahu as a whole, talking about this particular aspect of interpersonal behavior is not the common Avera he talks about. Yeshayahu, Isaiah, talks about it quite a lot. Hashem doesn't want insincere korbanos. Even Yecheskel in Babylonia talks about oppressing the widow and the orphan. Yirmiyahu, indeed, wouldn't meet the definition of prophetic Judaism under the Reform movement, because Yirmiyahu talks about the sin of idolatry as a betrayal of God, and he uses the image of the harlot very, very often, the prostitute, the unfaithful wife. He talks about Avodah Zarah. He talks about desecration of Shabbos. Yirmiyahu is not a big social justice prophet. Yeshayahu is, Micha is, Amos is. Right? Amos is the most quoted prophet in the American political system. Every politician likes to quote Amos for whatever reason. Let justice roll like water. Martin Luther King used to quote that verse quite a lot, and the like. So it's interesting why Yirmiyahu all of a sudden does talk about Bein Adam L'Chaveru. Now, why there's a difference? I mean, certainly we're not going to make the claim Yirmiyahu is indifferent to social injustice. Right? Yirmiyahu is only Bein Adam L'Chaveru, not Bein Adam L'Makom, not Bein Adam L'Chaveru. That's certainly not true. But some Mefarshim suggest that history plays a role here. When Yeshayahu was giving prophecy, the 10 tribes were a rich, affluent, large, and powerful kingdom. So the lifestyle was hedonistic, materialistic. Rich people were exploiting the labor of the poor. And therefore, the main Averos Am Yisrael were engaged in were these interpersonal Averos, which they thought they could cover up by ritualistic worship in the temple. And God is saying, God doesn't want these insincere korbanos. You have to understand, by the time Yirmiyahu is on the scene, number one, the kingdom of the 10 tribes has been destroyed. But number two, the remaining kingdom of Yehuda is small, is powerless, is impoverished. And of course, right now, they're a vassal of Babylon anyway. They've already been conquered by Babylon, and there's already been a significant exile. So consequently, the concept of the rich exploiting the poor was not a major issue because nobody was rich. I mean, it reminds me, I think in one of Chekhov's plays, he just has a scene that, in Russia, pre-revolutionary Russia, Tsarist Russia, everybody had to have a servant. You were not considered a dignified person unless you have a servant. So there was some guy who was so poor, all he had was water, didn't even have tea. But he had a servant whose job it was to boil his water, right? So everybody had to have a servant. So the thing is, therefore, the concept of social exploitation was not as major an issue in Yirmiyahu's time, simply because people were poor, there was a lot of anxiety, and instead the major issue was they're looking around for God to help them, and if Hashem doesn't help them, they'll turn to idols. False prophets in the name of God were very, very prominent and the like. So each Navi is addressing the particular Averis of the time. But even going with that very interesting thought, we still have this issue. Why does Yirmiyahu bring up this idea of slavery, since he normally does not bring up the Bein Adam L'Chaveru issue so much? So the truth of the matter is, the key is a pasuk at the very end of the Haftorah, which actually says the following. It's actually a very, very famous pasuk. Most of the Haftorah simply says, you're not following the rules of freeing the slaves, so you will be enslaved collectively. But then we have a famous pasuk, which is a more general verse. Ko amar Hashem, im lo birisi yomam v'layla, if not for my covenant of day and night, chukos shamayim v'aretz lo samti, I would not have established the natural laws that govern heaven and earth. It's a bit of an obscure verse, but Chazal understand this verse to refer to the covenant of the Torah, that without the covenant I made with Am Yisrael to give them the Torah, which is to be studied day and night, the world would cease to exist. The world exists. The universe exists only because the Jews accepted the Torah. In fact, the Maharal of Prague says a very interesting point. You know, we have a Chazal that say that Hashem held Mount Sinai over Bnei Yisrael, and said, if you accept the Torah, that's great. If you don't accept the Torah, I'm going to flatten you. And the Gemara seems to suggest we were forced into accepting the Torah. Now the question is, if we were forced into accepting the Torah, then why are we praised for coming forth and saying, Na'aseh v'nishma, whatever God says we will do? We were forced into it. So here's what Maharal says. Maharal says exactly the opposite. Hashem didn't hold the mountain over our heads before we said Na'aseh v'nishma. Hashem held the mountain over our heads after we said Na'aseh v'nishma, meaning to say, after we voluntarily accepted the Torah, without duress, without coercion, Hashem then reveals to us how momentous our decision was. As if to say, wow, it's lucky you made the right decision. If you didn't make the right decision, the world would cease to exist. But I couldn't tell you that, because if I tell you, accept the Torah, I'm going to blow up the world, you're being forced into it. So by definition, the Maharal says, we had to accept the Torah willingly. But if we wouldn't have done it willingly, the world would have disappeared. So it's like, wow, you made the right decision. So the world exists. When I say world, the whole universe exists only so there would be a holy nation that would accept the Torah. And the word bris, as describing Matan Torah, a covenantal relationship, is actually used in Parshat Mishpatim. Parshat Mishpatim is a little out of order, and Rashi says it's out of order. Towards the end, it talks about the sprinkling of the blood, the bringing of korbanos, and the famous verse, whatever Hashem says, Na'aseh v'nishma, that is in Parshat Mishpatim, not in Parshat Yisrael. I'll discuss why that's so. So, Yirmiyahu's point about slavery is making a much larger point. Slavery, in many, many ways, is a betrayal, even though it's tolerated and allowed. But fundamentally, it is a form of betrayal of the covenant. And this is true both from the perspective of the enslaver and from the perspective of the slave. From the perspective of the slave, we already examined it in the context of the nirtza, in the context of the piercing of the ear, that if a human being wants to assume subservience to another human being, that is wrong, because one should owe their allegiance only to God. One should not submit to the rule of another person. In fact, to some degree, the Navi Shmuel criticized the Jewish people for even wanting a king. Hashem is your king. Why do you need a king? Right? Theoretically, we should just submit to the will of Hashem. We need a king because society is often not willing just to walk in God's laws, so we need coercion, we need laws, we need governmental structures. Right? But the ideal situation, Shmuel said, would be the law of God itself would be enough to keep society moral and righteous and in its place. So for a person to voluntarily elect slavery is considered to be sinful, because you're placing Hashem with some other idea. Now, if you take the idea a little further with some homiletical license, the point is, anytime you make anything your master other than Hashem, that is a betrayal. A person can make many things their master. A person could make their careers, their hedonism, their materialism, their own ego. Right? I could become a slave to my ego, to my arrogance. Right? And I'm making myself a slave to something other than Hashem. You know, there's, I don't know if he's still alive, but there was a black actor, Mr. T. I don't know what his real name is, but, and his persona was that he would typically wear a lot of gold jewelry around his neck. And when he was asked why he wears the jewelry, he said, and I always thought this was very perceptive of him, he said he wants to imitate his ancestors who came to the United States from Africa, and they came as slaves in chains. So he wears chains to imitate his ancestors, to emulate, to connect to his ancestors. But the difference is, their chains were iron around their legs, and his are gold around the neck. So I don't know if Mr. T meant the meaning I'm going to put into his words. Perhaps it was accidental. But Mr. T is a big chiddush here, and that is the gold chain around the neck is also slavery. Right? You could be a slave to a taskmaster, and you could be a slave to materialism and hedonism and everything else. So, becoming a slave is moving away from the bris. Mishpatim describes Matan Torah as a bris. The end of the Haftorah says, without the bris, the covenant, the world has no purpose of existing. So slavery is not just a question of an avera, it's a particular avera, but it represents a betrayal of that bris. It's also true from the perspective of the master. Who are we to be masters over other people? Halavai v'halavai, we should be masters over ourselves. Ezehu Gibor, Pirkei Avos says, who is a mighty person, who is a heroic person? HaKovesh es Yitzro, one who controls the evil or the negative dispositions within him. Self-control. The pasuk says in Mishlei, Pirkei Avos actually got it from Mishlei. Umoshel berucho milo chedir. He who rules over the stormy, tempestuous personality that one might have is greater than the person who conquers the city. My role in life is to dominate other people, control other people. I should control myself. And then, good things will happen. So, slavery by definition is kind of a double betrayal of the bris. The slave who says, I put my trust in other people to take care of me, instead of Hashem. And the master that says, I dominate other people, instead of subjugating myself to the rule of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this might explain the question that was raised at the very beginning about collective punishment, because we can assume that not every Jew had slaves, not every Jew committed the particulars of this Avera, but to the degree that this Avera is symptomatic of abrogating the covenant, it is really exemplary. In other words, it's indicative of the merida, of the rebellion that Klal Yisrael had against the rule of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's why, and therefore I would suggest that the connection to the Haftorah is much larger than simply connecting it to the very first Avera. Rather, Parshat Mishpatim is about the bris that Hashem made with Am Yisrael at Matan Torah, and slavery represents the betrayal of the bris. Again, slavery is one of the more difficult issues. There are certain parts of the Torah that we sometimes have difficulty fully understanding the morality of, like Amalek, killing Amalek, different types of things. And it's been suggested that there are some types of institutions that the Torah tolerates by regulating in a more civilized way, but they are not considered optimal. It's been suggested that slavery might be one of those things. Certainly, the laws of slavery, even for the non-Jewish slave, were far, far, far more humane than existed in the ancient world, and therefore the Torah sometimes tolerates institutions which on an optimal level would not exist. But I had discussed this before. I do have a difficulty with this, because although the Jewish slave goes free after 6 years unless he wants to go through the ear piercing, and then he remains a slave until Yovel, a non-Jewish slave does not go free unless he is freed, which can be done, and yet, the Gemara tells us, it is prohibited to free your non-Jewish slave. If you do it, it's valid, right? I think it was Washington, a lot of the founding fathers in the United States were slave owners, and quite a few of them freed their slaves in their wills. They didn't free them when they were alive, but they freed. Jefferson did not, by the way. Jefferson actually, the slaves were yarshant by his heirs, although Jefferson, it is fairly well established, actually had an affair and had children from one of his slaves, but he did not free his slaves, which is an interesting question. Why not? But be it as it may, according to halacha, an Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish slave, is inherited, and you're not supposed to free him, because the Torah says, Li'olam bahem tavodu, he shall work forever. And the Gemara gives us a famous story of an exception, that Rabbi Eliezer walked into a shul with his non-Jewish slave, and there were 9 people and the slave. The slave would be number 10, but a slave, an unfreed slave, does not count for a minyan. So he freed the slave. That's a very significant sacrifice, because the slave was a major economic investment. That's like, he gave up a whole slave just for one tefillah to have a minyan. And the Gemara asks on it, how can he free a slave? You're not supposed to free your slave. And the Gemara's answer is, for a special mitzvah like this, it was permitted. So what bothers me about this, and this is what bothers me, and that is, if we understand that slavery was never a desirable institution in the Torah, it was simply a tolerated institution, meaning Hashem said, well, listen, everybody in the ancient world had slaves, so we're not going to tell Jews they can't, because that would be too difficult a standard for them to live by, so we will tolerate it, but we will regulate it, and we will require humane treatment, but it's not inherently the Ratzon Hashem that there should be slaves. So I think we're back to a big problem. Then why should it be forbidden for me to free my slave? We ought to say the opposite, that we're not going to make you free your slave, but if you do so, it is a virtuous act. So that seems to suggest the very fact that you're not supposed to free your slave, a non-Jewish slave, indicates that there was something desirable in the institution of non-Jewish slavery, which kind of undercuts the argument that this is tolerated but not really admired. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, can we infer from this episode of the man who freed his slave in order to complete a minyan, that if you want to free your slave, for example, out of gratitude for a lifetime of service, as was often done in the Roman Empire, all you have to do is invite 8 friends for a minyan, and you're the 9th, and the slave.
You could engineer the situation.
Absolutely. I mean, isn't it kind of?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
But
I'm not sure if you can manufacture it. Meaning to say, if there is a show that has a regularly scheduled minyan, I'm not sure if you can say, I'm going to do a private one in my house and make a minyan party. Yeah.
Could it be somehow related to the idea that when you do free him, he is a convert?
That's correct.
Not searching for them or...
No, that's correct. But is that a reason not to free him, or the reason that... Now, again, so the assumption might be on a more benign level that being a slave in a Jewish household was a way to educate and uplift the savage, primitive pagan and bring him to a higher, more uplifting standard. In fact, Aristotle, for example, offers almost precisely that type of justification for slavery.
Traditional rationale for colonialism.
Yeah, right, which is the idea that we are helping the savage beast become a more civilized person. But the difference would be that the way Jewish slavery worked, it may have actually accomplished that. I mean, it as opposed to just being words. So these are questions. I don't have answers for it, but I do want to suggest that at least the institution of the Jewish slave, because Parshat Mishpatim actually does not talk about the non-Jewish slave. That's elsewhere in the Torah. But the Jewish slave is a betrayal of bris, and because it's a betrayal of bris, that is why it is so pivotally connected to the Haftorah. And the word bris that appears at the very end, Imlo Barisi, Yomam V'Layla, Chuko Shemayim V'Aretz Lo Samti. Yeah.
Well, if when he gets freed, he's going to become a Jew, then how are we helping him by keeping him a slave?
Well, because he's going to become a Jew, but what kind of Jew is he going to become? Meaning there is a concept that the longer he remains in a kosher Jewish environment, the better it might be.
Even though he doesn't have as many mitzvahs.
Yes, right. A non-Jewish slave is chayiv in mitzvahs like a woman, which actually means if she is a a shivcha, she's the same as a Jewish woman. It's only a man that would have the difference. Chazal were very suspicious, not Chazal, but Chazal understood that the Torah itself was very suspicious that once an Eved is free, he would rapidly degenerate into his pagan ways, idolatrous ways. So Chazal did not really have trust in the rectitude of the Eved, and that's how they understood the Torah as well. Okay, let me just end with one very, very interesting thought. All of us know that the very famous formula by which the Jews accepted the Torah was Naseh v'nishma, right? Those famous words, we will do and we will understand, and the significance of that is we're giving God a blank check. See, if you say nishma, let us hear, v'naseh, and we'll do it, that would imply a certain amount of conditionality, meaning, let's hear what you're offering, and then we'll see if we're going to do it. When you say naseh, we will do, and you don't even know what it is, and then you say, so tell us what it is, that's giving Hashem a blank check, and that's the highlight of emunah, of absolute trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But what's so fascinating is these are such famous words, but if you look in last week's Parsha, which is the Ten Commandments, the Jewish people did not say Naseh v'nishma. They only said Na'aseh. And you're almost waiting. You hear that pasuk, Kol asher diber Hashem Na'aseh. You're saying, hey, is there something missing from the Chumash? Something missing from the Torah? Well, what about Naseh v'nishma? So do not be afraid. In this week's Parsha, we have Naseh v'nishma. But the question is, why do we have these two verses? One says, Kol asher diber Hashem Na'aseh, and Kol asher diber Hashem Na'aseh v'nishma. So we have a very beautiful pshat from the Meshech Chochmah of Meir Simcha that says, prophetically, the Torah is encoding these two different ways of accepting Torah because it represents two different epochs in Jewish history as it would envelop in the future. And that is, we know, all of us know that Chazal had a Masorah, a tradition, that there are 613 mitzvos in the Torah, even though the count is somewhat problematical, but we say 613, and we divide it into 248 positive and 365 negative. Chazal correlate both the positive and the negative to parts of your body. There are 248 bones, and each mitzvah saseh that you do gives some type of spiritual life. We don't know exactly what that means because, as far as I know, you don't get arthritis if you don't do certain mitzvahs, but it gives a certain vibrancy to your bones. And the 365 corresponds to sinews or ligaments, and if you violate a negative commandment, it affects something. Now, here is the problem. So it turns out that the 613 correlates to the parts of my body, every person's body. But here's the thing. There's never been a single individual that can keep all 613 mitzvahs. Some are for men and not women, some are women, not men, some are kohanim. Many only apply in Eretz Yisrael, of course, and many apply only when there's a Beis HaMikdash. So it turns out that even if you're the greatest tzaddik in the world, you will not be able to keep 613. And yet, if 613 is somehow correlated to the spiritual perfection of my limbs and my sinews, then Hashem has created a standard that can never be met. Each one of us, no matter how righteous, is defective. We're missing something. How could that be? How do I get the light of the 613 when it's not shaykh, it's not possible for me to keep the 613? So the Mefarshim say there are two answers to this. Answer number one is the importance of learning Torah. Because when I learn Torah, I can learn not only the mitzvos that I'm able to keep, but I can even learn the mitzvos I'm not able to keep. Chazal say, for example, he who occupies himself with the laws of korbanos is as if he brought a korban. That's why the Chafetz Chaim writes. The Chafetz Chaim, in addition to the Mishnah Berurah and the books on Lashon Hara, actually wrote many, many svarim on Kutshim, on the service in the Beis HaMikdash. And somebody criticized him. He says, why don't you spend time on halacha works? As if the Chafetz Chaim didn't spend time on halacha works. He says, why are you writing about things that are not relevant to halacha? And the Chafetz Chaim gave two answers. Answer number one is if you believe in Mashiach, and you believe that the Beis Hamikdash can come every day, this is relevant lahalacha. Why are you assuming this has no practical relevance? You don't believe Mashiach might come? That's answer number one. But answer number two is that there's a specific importance in even learning things that are not practical, because that is the only way my neshama can get the light of that mitzvah. Think about this. There are many mitzvahs I'm not even supposed to keep. For example, giving a get. One of the 613 mitzvahs in the Torah is that if a man wants to divorce his wife, he must give her a get. Now that has to correspond to some limb in my body, right? There must be a get limb because 248. So what does that mean? If I say, I'm sorry, honey, I got to give you a get because otherwise I'm not going to be perfected, right? That would be an absurd. So obviously it's not Hashem's will that we just go around divorcing our wives if there's no reason to want to do that. So how do you fulfill? How does a person get the get bone? So you got to learn Maseches Gittin, right? You learn the laws of Gittin, etc. And in that way, your neshama absorbs the goodness in that mitzvah. Okay, that's answer number one, Talmud Torah. Answer number two is the path of Avas Yisrael, unity, love, togetherness. What's the connection? Because when I stand before Hashem as an individual, there are so many mitzvahs I cannot do. But when I connect myself to the nation of Israel with love and achdus, then I become a limb or maybe even a cell on a transcendental organism that has a past, present, and future. So the same way, when I put tefillin on my arm, I don't say, my arm put on tefillin today. I put on tefillin because my arm is part of me. When I am mechaber myself to Am Yisrael, the mitzvos of the women are the mitzvos of the men, the mitzvos of the past are the mitzvos of the present. Because I am part of a collective entity. And therefore, that is how I am mashlim, taryag mitzvah. So these are the two pathways, Talmud Torah and Avas Yisrael. So says the Meshech Chochmah, this is merumaz in the differential wording. In Parshat Yisrael, it says the following: Vaya'anu kol ha'am yachdav, underline yachdav. Everybody answered in unison. So that pasuk is talking about when there is love, when there's achdus, when there's connection, we can declare everything Hashem commands us, na'aseh, we will do. I cannot do everything, you cannot do everything. We can do everything because we're connected. But in Parshat Mishpatim, it says Vayanu ha'am, but it does not say the word yachdav. That's a remez. What happens when there's hatred, polarization, dissension, lack of unity? At that point, we can't say we can do, because I can't do it and you can't do it and we're not together. So you got to go to plan B, Naseh v'nishma, which the Meshech Chochmah interprets, we will do v'nishma by our learning and by our understanding. So plan A is yachdav, we're together, Avas Yisrael. Plan B is through the Torah learning, right? These are the two answers that are merumaz in the pasuk. So these seem like two different roads, the path of Avas Yisrael and the path of Torah learning. But in fact, they are two roads that ultimately converge. Because Chazal give us a very important teaching. We say this, actually in Eretz Yisrael, the meaning is we say it every day, but the standard Ashkenaz Nusach is only on Shabbos, and that is, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. People who learn Torah, they're supposed to increase peace in the world. So Limud of Torah is supposed to be a vehicle for peace. Peace meaning, how do you get peace? Peace is not by ignoring each other, but peace meaning Avas Yisrael, bringing people together. Now, if you ask me the very difficult question, so how come there was so much bitterness and divisiveness among people who learn Torah? I don't know. I don't have an answer. All I can say is, Chazal say that's not the way it's supposed to be. Torah learning is supposed to bring peace into the world. So therefore, in a world where there is dissension, in which there is sinas chinam, the pathway of Talmud Torah pursued in a true manner will actually lead to togetherness and the building of bridges. So the Meshech Chochmah says that is why we have these two different psukim, because the Torah is merames that we will be mashlim, we will complete the light of the 613 in one of two ways, Ahavas Yisrael or Talmud Torah, and through Talmud Torah we should be zocha to come to Ahavas Yisrael. So we will have a good week and a good Shabbos.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things that puzzles me about the slave story,
Yeah.
and I think it kind of gives us a little bit of grays instead of blacks and whites, is the whole thing about leaving your family. You know, the choice of it the slave has, you can stay a slave or you can leave your family. And I know with...
So let me just
Can you
explain the
explain
issue here.
that?
We're certainly not talking about the family that he came in with. We're actually talking about a special master prerogative that if I have a Jewish slave, I can give him a maidservant with whom they'll have children that remain my slaves. So that's the family that he may have to leave because they are not really his family. They are my slaves that I gave him for breeding purposes. If he came with his own wife, then the Torah says he certainly leaves with his own wife, and the master has no claim on that whatsoever.
Or any subsequent children?
What?
Any subsequent
No,
children?
the same thing. In other words, any children that he has, even while he's a slave, from his pre-existing wife, so to speak, they're his family. The only thing the master can keep are, I gave you my maidservant to reproduce, so those are mine. That's my property.
Are the maidservants that we're talking about always non-Jews?
Yes, they're non-Jewish maidservants.
They're not
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, yeah,
Mimitzrayim galtanu, mibeit avadim pititanu.
yeah.
There seems to be a redundancy. From Egypt we will be redeemed, and from the house of slavery we will be redeemed. What's going on?
So I think that this actually ties into our point, and that is, Mibeis Avadim could be understood as a mindset of slavery, meaning God took us out of Egypt, but more than just taking it out of Egypt, he also designed to liberate us from the mindset that we should be subservient to other human beings. And therefore, even within our own land, it is not proper that we should be in a house of servitude or a house of slavery. I think that's the point that's being made. I took you out of Egypt, so you will be liberated from the mindset of belonging into a house of servitude or a house of slavery. In fact, this goes back to why the concept of the nirtza, the pierced ear, is so severely criticized. You know the Ibn Ezra's famous point. The Ibn Ezra made a point that the Jews at the Yam Suf were panicky, right? The Egyptians are coming after them. But it's very, very clear there were many, many more Jews than there were Egyptians. And in fact, Chazal understand the pasuk that the Jews even had armaments. They had arms. They had swords. They had spears. So they could have overpowered the Egyptians. But the Ibn Ezra says that you see the devastating, controlling power of a slave mentality, like the Stockholm Syndrome or whatever it would be, in which when they see the masters coming, they lose all courage. And the Ibn Ezra says that is why only Moshe Rabbeinu, from a rational level, obviously there are deep spiritual levels, why Moshe Rabbeinu was our leader, but he said only someone who did not grow up in servitude would have the strength and the courage to take a nation out of slavery. It would have been very, very difficult for the slaves themselves to ever make that decision. Yeah.
Would the Maharal disagree with the famous Parshat that by Purim we accepted the Torah again out of free will?
Yeah, I have to check because you're 100% correct. The Maharal's Pshat is, you can't disagree with it because it's in the Gemara, but the Maharal's Pshat seems to run contrary to the famous Gemara, right? That's a very, very excellent question. The Gemara makes the point that on Shavuos we were forced into receiving the Torah, and on Purim we reaccepted the Torah out of free will. That's a famous idea. That's why Purim is a joyous day, because not only were we saved, but we accepted the Torah out of love and not out of fear. The question is, according to the explanation of the Maharal that I gave you, even the first time, we accepted it willingly, and then Hashem showed us how we had to accept it. It is a very excellent kasha. I have to check. I don't know how the Maharal will interpret that Gemara, but that's a good point. Okay, thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
one more
I
thing.
just want to make sure if the slave was stolen, was sold into slavery, didn't cover the debt, so it can be sold again and again and again.
I believe the halacha is he can be sold as many times as is necessary to repay the debt. That's correct.
Or if Yovel comes.
If what?
Yovel.
Or Yovel, that's right. Of course, what happens if Yovel comes? What happens to the debt, right?
Right.
Well, the answer is, then it just remains a liability, meaning he still owes the money. In other words, Yovel does not erase the debt, but slavery can no longer be imposed on him as a
Where can he
result.
just be enslaved, if he's going to be freed and enslaved again, where can he just be enslaved again after Yovel?
It seems that's not, in other words, let it just be a new sale, but it seems, I mean, I have to check, I honestly don't know, but it seems to me that if the theft for which he's being sold is a pre-Yovel event, Yovel says you can't punish him for that. Now, if he steals after Yovel, that's a new business. Every time it's after some Yovel, right? So obviously he could be resold for that. Okay, take care.